Merci, mon cher collègue. La parole est maintenant à M. Paul Dobret de la Roumanie. Vous avez la parole, M. Dobret.
Monsieur le vice-président, chers collègues, nous sommes tous très conscients que l'un des aspects les plus importants des menaces transnationales est la traite des êtres humains. La Roumanie est un partenaire actif qui travaille avec des organismes comme Europol, Interpol, Eurojust, Frontex et Centre Sud-Est européen d'application de la loi. La Roumanie apprécie l'importance des partenariats dans le domaine de la prévention et de la lutte contre la traite et continuera à travailler avec tous les acteurs internationaux pour atteindre cet objectif. Prenant en considération les avantages de partager la collecte de données dans le domaine de la traite des êtres humains et en particulier dans l'esclavage des temps modernes, nous devons lutter pour une meilleure harmonisation des données sur le flux des migrants illégaux à travers les États participants. Une attention particulière devait être accordée aux frontières extérieures de l'Union européenne. Par conséquent, je tiens à souligner que la Roumanie est l'un des 9 États membres qui ont notifié la Commission européenne sur la transposition en droit national de la directive européenne numéro 36 de 2011 sur la prévention et la lutte contre la traite des êtres humains et la protection des victimes. L'adhésion à Schengen a été un objectif majeur de la politique nationale et européenne depuis une considérable période de temps. Dans ce sens, la Roumanie a agi largement et a réussi à atteindre un bon niveau, notamment dans l'administration de la frontière. Les allocations financières du budget de l'Union européenne et à la fois du budget national ont été relativement importantes et ont conduit à des résultats escomptés. À cet égard, je tiens à mentionner que l'équipement technique roumain et la formation de personnel sont conformes aux dernières exigences de Schengen. Chers collègues, permettez-moi d'attirer votre attention sur les activités menées au sein du Parlement de la Roumanie dans le domaine de la lutte contre la traite. Il y a 4 ans, nous avons créé le groupe parlementaire pour la lutte contre la traite des personnes. Je tiens à souligner que notre groupe a publié le premier rapport qui aborde les dimensions de la traite des êtres humains transmis par un Parlement d'un État européen. Au début de septembre 2013, le président de la Chambre des députés de la Roumanie a eu un entretien avec la représentante spéciale de OSCE pour la lutte contre la traite des êtres humains, Mme Marcia Grazia Gianmarinaro. En conséquence, la partie roumaine a avancé la proposition d'organiser l'année prochaine à Bucarest un atelier visant à aborder le sujet dans la région des Balkans avec la participation des États membres de l'Union européenne limitrophes des pays des Balkans. Cette
Il faut conclure, mon cher collègue.
Très courte, peut être attendue à d'autres pays de la région. Je vous remercie.
Merci, M. Dobret. La parole est maintenant à M. Michel Voisin de la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Permettez-moi, dans le cadre de ce débat sur les menaces transnationales, d'attirer encore une fois votre attention sur la situation en Afghanistan en tant que représentant spécial de notre Assemblée. 2014 est une année charnière pour la sécurité de l'Afghanistan. C'est l'année où s'achève la 5e et dernière phase du processus de transition entre la FIAS et les forces de sécurité afghanes, et c'est aussi l'année prochaine qu'aura lieu le scrutin présidentiel fixé au 5 avril. Les lois électorales qui fixent la préparation des élections ont enfin été promulguées les 17 et 20 juillet derniers. Ces lois ont été saluées par la communauté internationale, mais un cadre législatif ne garantit pas un scrutin pacifique. Sans la maîtrise du terrain par les forces afghanes, la sincérité du scrutin sera altérée. Ce qui est nécessaire aujourd'hui pour espérer une transition vers un Afghanistan démocratique, stable et pacifié, c'est un véritable dialogue, un dialogue entre les principaux partis qui acceptent la Constitution d'une part mais un dialogue également avec les factions talibanes. Ce dialogue, pourtant, est toujours au point mort, et l'enjeu et la solution du conflit afghan dépassent ses frontières. Les États voisins sont partie prenante. Le renforcement des relations entre l'Inde et l'Afghanistan, notamment le partenariat stratégique signé le 4 octobre 2011, a vivement inquiété leur voisin commun, le Pakistan. Le risque d'isolement du Pakistan entre deux pays alliés est lourde menace pour sa sécurité. La stabilisation de la région ne passe donc pas seulement par la pacification du seul Afghanistan. Une réflexion plus globale doit être menée, incluant les autres acteurs étatiques, si l'on ne veut pas que l'aide de la communauté internationale pose les bases d'un futur conflit entre l'Afghanistan et le Pakistan. L'OSCE doit jouer un rôle primordial dans les efforts internationaux pour assurer la stabilité et instaurer la confiance dans l'Afghanistan post-2014, a souligné le secrétaire général Lamberto Zanier devant l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies il y a 2 semaines. Une collaboration avec les autres organisations internationales présentes sur le terrain est à mes yeux indispensable, car les défis sont de taille. En premier lieu, est-on capable au niveau international d'encourager le dialogue au sein du pays? Et deuxièmement, comment faire pour intégrer un Pakistan largement déstabilisé dans le processus de transition démocratique en Afghanistan? Dans ce cadre, nous devons redoubler 30 secondes d'attention sur la situation en Afghanistan. Le 84e Rose Road séminaire de l'AP-OTAN, qui se tiendra à Bichkek du 13 au 15 novembre, aura pour ordre du jour l'Afghanistan et l'avenir de la région, une coopération globale, et j'y participerai avec mon collègue Thierry Mariani pour y représenter notre Assemblée.
Merci, Monsieur Voisin.
10 secondes. L'envoi de parlementaires sur le terrain dans le contexte électoral qui se prépare nécessiterait courage et endurance de la part des observateurs. Croyez-en mon expérience de terrain, mais ce serait un véritable message de soutien et d'espoir qu'enverrait ainsi notre Assemblée. Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'ai moins parlé que les panélistes.
Merci, Monsieur Voisin, mais vous avez dépassé quand même votre temps de parole. La parole est maintenant à Madame Rabeyat Azanova de l'Azerbaïdjan.
Спасибо, господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги. В современном мире происходят кардинальные изменения в сфере обеспечения международной безопасности. И не раз в рамках заседания ОБСЕ мы обсуждали эти проблемы, и международное сообщество стало свидетелем ощутимого успеха. И сегодня мы обсуждаем одну из таких страшных угроз – международный терроризм. Транснациональные угрозы многочисленны и комплексны по своей сути. Они взаимосвязаны. И этим представляют собой еще большие вызовы как в регионе ОБСЕ, так и во всем мире. В настоящее время в мире действует 500 террористических организаций. Только за последние 10 лет было совершено 6500 терактов, от которых пострадало огромное количество людей. И все это после 11 сентября 2001 года. И пока мы ищем противодействие этой угрозе, происходит трансформация тактики международного терроризма. Первое. Наблюдается объединение усилий отдельных экстремистских групп и криминальных структур на международном уровне. Второе. Происходит ужесточение форм и методов террора. Повышается опасность технологического террора. Третье. Информационный или электронный терроризм, гиберпреступность приобретает особое значение. Четвертое, происходит увеличение людских и финансовых институтов. Это только некоторые черты международного терроризма. Ни одно государство не в состоянии бороться с этим явлением в одиночку. Азербайджанская республика одна из первых присоединилась к антитеррористической коалиции и продолжает прикладывать усилия и содействовать борьбе с терроризмом. Мы уверены, только объединенными усилиями всего мирового сообщества можно прийти к реальным плодам и создать эффективную систему противодействия международного терроризма в каждом отдельном государстве и в мире в целом. Уважаемые друзья, в хартии ОБСЕ о предупреждении терроризма и борьбе с ним государства-участники подтверждают свое обязательство принимать меры, необходимые для защиты от терактов, прав человека и основных свобод, особенно право на жизнь каждого, кто находится под их юрисдикцией. И поэтому нашим девизом должен быть общая ответственность за общие судьбы. Спасибо за внимание.
La parole est maintenant à Madame Vilija Aleknet-Abramikian de Lituanie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, first of all, I want to thank all the speakers for their speeches and express my solidarity with the states of Central Asia in the context of threats coming from the neighboring regions, as well my appreciation to assistance provided by Central Asian countries to Afghanistan. In our turbulent times, solidarity and trust among the states, among all states, especially of the OSCE, is of the utmost importance. This lays at the core of the Helsinki Plus 40 process launched by our organization. In this context, I would like to present several remarks regarding doubtful transparency of the military exercises performed by Russia and Belarus, Zapad 2013, that have recently ended. The active phase of the aforementioned exercises took place on 20 to 26 September this year, not only to Latvian but very close to Lithuanian borders. It's a positive moment that our observers were invited to observe the show days of exercise in Belarus and Kaliningrad. However, what raises our concern is the fact that information provided to international organizations before the exercises started and what really was going on ground is not the same thing. Public sources of the Russian Federation revealed the facts that during the exercises, a number of sudden inspections of combat readiness of military unions were performed, and transfer of units from other parts of Russia was executed. Unexpected changes during planned exercises in units occurred. Other state paramilitary troops, state institutions, and defense reserve and mobilization systems were exercised as well. Finally, after the exercise, Russian political military leadership announced that exercise covered larger territories than it was announced. From the Baltic to the Barents Sea, I could add. Russia claimed that the exercise were targeted against terrorism, but the facts state that it had expressed the anti-Western scenario. This scenario and nature of the West 2013 leave no doubt that the Russian-Belarusian forces were training to conduct regular military operations, and their potential opponent is the NATO countries bordering with Russia and Belarus. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Merci, Madame Abramikian. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Dean Allison du Canada.
My fellow parliamentarians, I would like to focus my remarks on the importance of increased vigilance and cooperation in the fight against corruption. As you know, bribery and corruption poses a serious threat to good governance, respect for the rule of law, and economic prosperity. As the OSCE Minister Council recognized in Dublin in 2012, weak governance can also be a factor that aids the spread of terrorism and transnational crime. As parliamentarians, we have an important role to play in combating transnational corruption and bribery. In particular, we can work together to ensure that our national legal systems have appropriate tools to ensure that private sector actors cannot, without impunity, attempt to gain advantage through bribery or corruption abroad. This spring, Canada passed legislation to strengthen our anti-bribery laws in response to recommendations from the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I chaired the Parliamentary Committee where this legislation was considered, and I would like to share some of the law's highlights with you today. First, the law increases the maximum penalty of imprisonment for bribery of a foreign public official, a change that will ensure that the seriousness of this crime is reflected when offenders are sentenced. Second, the legislation creates a new books and records offense to ensure that individuals and companies cannot cook their books to hide the payments of foreign bribes. The law also expands the jurisdiction of Canadian courts over bribery of public officials committed by Canadians outside of our borders, by removing the requirements for prosecutors to prove a substantial connection to Canada. An exception currently exists in our anti-bribery law that permits payments to foreign public officials in order to expedite or ensure or that the official does something he is already obliged to do. These so-called facilitation payments will be criminalized in the same way as other forms of bribery once the amendments come into force. Finally, the legislation will create a more consistent approach to the investigation and prosecution of foreign bribery offenses by centralizing the responsibility for such crimes in our National Police Force, the RCMP. Together, these legislative changes can signal Canada's zero-tolerance approach to corruption. They also send a clear message that Canada means business when we say that prosperity, security, and the rule of law go hand in hand. I look forward to hearing about the work of other OSCE parliaments to combat corruption and other transnational threats while promoting the rule of law. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur Allison. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Victor Dolidze de Géorgie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me thank Montenegro for excellent hospitality and President Krivo Kapic and as well speakers for their very encouraging speeches, I would say. Let me draw your attention of the extreme concern of Georgian side over the critical situation in two Georgia's territories occupied by the Russian Federation. Since January 2013, the Russian occupation forces and FSB border guards have begun the large-scale installation of barbed wires and fences along the occupation line in the Tkhinvali region. By now, the total length of the barbed wires along the Tkhinvali occupation line has reached 35 kilometers, and the process is ongoing even now. The installation of artificial obstacles along the occupation line significantly affects the livelihoods of the local population, divides the families and communities, and prevents people-to-people contacts. The installation of barbed wires in the villages of Tkhinvali region has already affected around 65 Georgian families, while several of them were forced to flee their places of the residence left behind the occupation line, thus creating a further wave of IDPs. Residents are prevented from accessing the local cemeteries, agricultural lands, potable and irrigation water systems, and reaching emergency medical services. Ladies and gentlemen, Georgia is a very active contributor of the operation and coalition against the terrorists, particularly in Afghanistan. You know that over 1,600 Georgian troops are on the ground, and we're going to continue this process after the transformation of this process next year. I think that such black holes and conflict regions are just free havens for terrorists, and this is the biggest threat not only for Georgia, not only for Russia, but for the whole very fragile, I would say, region, like Caucasus region. And once again, let me call upon the Russian side to fulfill the agreements, particularly the ceasefire agreement for 2008, 12th of August. You remember 6-point agreement, so-called Sarkozy mediation agreement on Georgia. We're going to continue Geneva talks in a multilateral fora, and we call on Russia to make adequate steps in this regard, as well as bilateral negotiations between Mr. Karasin and Mr. Zurababashidze. Thank you very much again.
Merci, Monsieur Dolidze. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Jaromir Stetina de la République tchèque.
Спасибо. Уважаемый господин председающий, уважаемые дамы и господа, я бы хотел сосредоточиться на одну из серьезных транснациональных угроз. Вы все, наверное, в этом зале помните, что была Берлинская стена. Она была построена в 1961 году и 28 лет распределяла Берлин. Мы в 1989 году, когда пала Берлинская стена, все верили, что уже других берлинских стен не будет. И я бы хотел напомнить, что уже с 2008 года, когда в Грузию вторгла внезапно 58-я армия Северокавказского военного округа, российская армия начала строить эти заборы с колючей проволокой, о которых говорил мой грузинский коллега. Он подробно сказал, что это значит. И я не сомневаюсь, что стройка новых берлинских стен является тоже национальной, транснациональной угрозой. Спасибо за внимание.
Merci. La parole est maintenant à M. Oleg Zarubensky de l'Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear Chairman, dear ladies and gentlemen, terrorism is one of the most dangerous threats for the life of everyone. And anyhow, every inhabitant of our planet is under the pressure of fear to be a victim of terrorism. And if in case of nuclear weapons, as an element of deterrence, there are arguments for and against, any discussion about chemical weapons is just out of the question. Mankind has recognized the appropriateness of its destruction. The convention was signed and entered into the force, which was ratified by the majority of states. And as is proved by practice, it is one thing to claim and another is to fulfill one's obligations. By 2007, the planet should have got rid of these weapons. At least it is stated so in paragraph 6 of Article 4 of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But we still live in the world where such weapons are not only available in the arsenals, but are also used against people. Raising of this problem is not just artificial or random. Ukraine, as a state that had the third largest in the world nuclear arsenal, will fully renounce such weapons. And it took place despite all discussions in our society in the early 90s that were focused on the expediency of such refusal. That is why we have the moral right to raise the problem of intensifying the implementation of all provisions of the Convention for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the destruction of it on the entire planet. We are convinced in the necessity to initiate strengthening of the refusing the chemical weapons within the OSCE countries organization, whose priority is the safety in our region. So it is reasonable to hold an international conference in the nearest future to work out the issue of the total destruction of all chemical weapons, both in the European continent and in the whole world. This is where we would raise the issue of sanctions to be applied to those countries that do not comply with decisions of the Convention, regardless of the fact whether we consider this country democratic or undemocratic. And the end. In half of a year, we will mark the sad historical date, a century age of the first mass use of chemical weapons. And it would be symbolic if by that time we would find an effective mechanism to leave these weapons only in history. Thank you very much.
Merci, M. Zarubensky. La parole est maintenant à M. Ikram Adirbekov du Kazakhstan.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Уважаемые коллеги, противодействие транснациональным угрозам, безусловно, является одним из ключевых вопросов в деятельности ОБСЕ. В данном контексте вызовы и угрозы, исходящие с территории Афганистана, как уже было отмечено выступавшими коллегами, остаются чрезвычайно актуальными как для стран Центральной Азии, Казахстана, так и для всего международного сообщества. В этих условиях укрепление сотрудничества ОБСЕ с Афганистаном является одним из приоритетов украинского представительства ОБСЕ в процессе подготовки к совещанию министров иностранных дел в Киеве, и Казахстан всемирно его поддерживает. Кстати говоря, действующий представитель ОБСЕ, господин Кожара, в настоящее время находится с визитом в Астане. Усилия ОБСЕ должны быть направлены прежде всего на содействие строительству стабильного, независимого демократического Афганистана, как это было заявлено главами наших государств и правительств в Астанинской декларации 2010 года. Говоря о координации действий международного сообщества, хотелось бы отметить Министерскую конференцию Стамбульского процесса по Афганистану, которые состоялись в апреле этого года в Алматы. Главным элементом международного содействия Афганистану, на наш взгляд, должна стать экономическая реабилитация. Наша страна, например, принимает активное участие в гуманитарных усилиях. Это образовательная программа по обучению молодых афганцев в Казахстане, безвозмездная техническая и гуманитарная помощь, строительство школ, больниц и дорог. Мы выступаем за расширение экономического сотрудничества в регионе и активного вовлечения Афганистана в интеграционные процессы. В данном контексте хотелось бы обратить ваше внимание на потенциал города Алматы. Это географически близкий к Афганистану мощный финансовый транспортный центр. В Алматы успешно функционирует порядка 20 агентств и институтов системы ООН, в том числе Центральноазиатский региональный центр по борьбе с наркотиками. И в этой связи Казахстан ведет работу с ООН по созданию в Алматы регионального хаба многостранной дипломатии, который в том числе будет заниматься постконфликтной реабилитацией в Афганистане. В этой связи приглашаем стран-участниц ОБСЕ к активному сотрудничеству в рамках развития на площадке Алматы. Спасибо за внимание.
Merci. La parole est maintenant à M. Michel Biou de la France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, mes chers collègues. Si le thème « Faire face au terrorisme et aux menaces transnationales » a été beaucoup développé, en revanche, j'ai peu entendu traiter la nécessité de protéger les droits de l'homme. Je vais donc insister sur ce point à travers un exemple. Dans notre déclaration d'Istanbul, nous avons appelé tous les États participants à se conformer pleinement à leurs engagements concernant les droits de l'homme, les libertés fondamentales et l'état de droit. Nous avons aussi demandé à l'OSCE de surveiller le respect des droits de l'homme dans les États participants et d'agir avec diligence lorsque les États ne se conforment pas à leurs engagements. C'est d'ailleurs ce que dit expressément la déclaration d'Astana en son paragraphe 6. Réunis à Istanbul, plusieurs intervenants ont particulièrement souligné l'importance de respecter les droits fondamentaux des minorités en Turquie. Ainsi avons-nous entendu une forte préoccupation devant la persistance de l'intolérance face à l'origine ethnique, aux langues minoritaires et aux religions dans la région. Néanmoins, comme l'a fait récemment l'Assemblée parlementaire du Conseil de l'Europe, je crois que nous pouvons relever des progrès réalisés depuis 2004, même de façon chaotique, en matière de promotion des droits culturels et linguistiques des Kurdes. Cela concerne entre autres l'usage d'autres langues que le turc dans l'enseignement, les médias et pendant les campagnes électorales depuis 2011 et la possibilité de choisir sa langue pour assurer sa défense devant les tribunaux depuis 2012. Aujourd'hui, de nouveaux pas pourraient être franchis si l'on considère les déclarations du Premier ministre Erdogan en faveur de négociations ou l'appel du leader Öcalan à renoncer à toute action militaire au seul bénéfice de l'action politique. Le débat aujourd'hui est aussi l'occasion de refuser l'amalgame entre terrorisme et opposition politique. Nous dénonçons avec force et justement les faits de terrorisme. Mais pour autant, la lutte contre le terrorisme ne saurait justifier l'incarcération persistante de milliers de Kurdes, y compris de très nombreux élus nationaux et locaux, des journalistes, des avocats et également beaucoup de femmes et d'adolescents, pour des faits supposés de complicité avec une organisation terroriste. Cette situation constitue un obstacle majeur pour trouver une issue politique. On ne peut accepter que la complicité supposée avec une organisation terroriste constitue le prétexte pour emprisonner des opposants politiques avec des périodes de détention préventive souvent très longues. À Monaco, nous avions rappelé la référence faite dans l'acte final d'Helsinki à la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme de 1948, selon laquelle Tout individu, je finis, tout individu a droit à la liberté d'opinion et d'expression. Cela implique le droit de ne pas être inquiété pour ses opinions. J'ai beaucoup d'amitié et de respect pour ce grand pays qu'est la Turquie. C'est pourquoi je suis persuadé que résoudre politiquement la question kurde consisterait à un progrès considérable qui profiterait à tout le pays comme à la paix dans cette région du monde. Les engagements d'Helsinki réaffirmés dans la déclaration d'Astana appellent donc notre organisation à soutenir plus activement le respect des droits de l'homme dans le processus en cours. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Merci, Monsieur Billou. La parole est maintenant à Madame Isabel Santos du Portugal.
Thank you. Yes, we all agree that terrorism is a serious crime that cannot be tolerated and demands a strong fight in a concerted transnational strategy. Yes, we are all aware of this and that terrorism is in itself one of the most serious threats to human rights. However, if we abandon the defense of human rights in order to fight a violent attack to these rights, then we will give in a way that will be irreparable to the values that are pillars of our societies and of the OSCE area as a community of values. A community based in the ideals of peace, democracy, and development, in the rule of law, and in the respect of human rights, cannot ignore these basic principles in the fight against terrorism. Countries that violate liberties and fundamental rights when combating terrorism are contributing to the victory of those who are threatening them. Transform societies and countries hostages of fear is the first and probably the biggest victory of any terrorist group. This is a victory that we must deny at all cost. It is our duty to assure that fighting terrorism and its mechanisms doesn't imply a restriction of fundamental freedoms, namely the freedom of speech and the freedom of movement. We must condemn in a strong way the form how some countries have been using the label of terrorist to persecute political opponents, and the abuse of the use of Interpol international arrest warrants, as well as extradition to countries where the respect of fundamental rights is not upheld. The use of torture, admitted by some as a form of obtaining information about terrorist activities, it's something that we cannot tolerate. This is a problem that we must face strongly condemning the methods that are clearly in contradiction with international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Santos. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Sevki Kuguloglu de Turquie.
Thank you for the floor, Mr. Vice President. Distinguished delegates and dear colleagues, the OSCE's human dimension is the core of our organization's comprehensive concept of security. This forum enables us, drawing attention to shortcomings in the implementation of existing human dimension commitments and also underlining the need for new ones. It is highly regrettable that the OSCE has been unable to adopt any decision in the human dimension in the previous 2 years. I believe the OSCE chairmanship will be able to overcome this tendency. I also welcome the Swiss chairmanship's intention to take up human rights in the economic crisis as one of the themes for next year. We parliamentarians should continue to influence and stimulate our public opinions for lively and productive discussions on all aspects of the human dimension. On the other hand, the subject of counterterrorism and human rights has been attracting considerable interest. Let us all remember that the effective counterterrorism measures and respect for human rights are complementary and mutually reinforcing. Thanks to our collective endeavors, we have covered significant ground in identifying areas and gaps that require enhanced cooperation against growing transboundary terrorism and related transnational threats. Countering violent extremism and radicalization, enhancing investigation of terrorist crimes, empowering victims of terrorism, capacity building for countering terrorism finance, as well as strengthening the rule of law remaining our priorities. We have to acknowledge that threat from terrorism constantly evolves, and unfortunately it does not seem to diminish. New trends such as the threats from self-radicalized individuals or the increase in the number of attacks on economically or otherwise sensitive infrastructure require proficiency and cleverness in our responses. These facts compel us to enhance coherence, complementary and agility of our existing counter-terrorism measures, as well as to develop new approaches and tools. While doing that, we should remain consistent and with our obligations under international law, in particular human rights law, and design effective counter-terrorism measures in full respect for human rights. In this regard, I have to stress that artificial prioritization of certain human rights issues to the detriment of others is likely to cause imbalance, which will result in disagreement. We therefore need to be sensitive to the sensitiveness of all others. Constructive engagement, goodwill, and mutual respect will certainly drive us in the right direction. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur Kılıçdaroğlu. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Andreas Kafkalias de Chypre.
Thank you, Mr. President. Dear colleagues, September 11 marked a turning point in the anti-terrorism course of action in the context and towards the implementation of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy. For its part, Cyprus includes the fight against terrorism in its foreign policy priorities. The Republic of Cyprus is a contracting party to all relevant international instruments and is fully committed to the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1373. In pursuing efforts towards a national counter-terrorist strategy, Cyprus attaches great importance to bilateral and multilateral cooperation for the purpose of gaining expertise and exchanging best practices. Albeit terrorism being condemnable in all its forms and manifestations, a unified understanding and definition of the threat called for by the UN Secretary General at the launching of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy in 2005 remains to be achieved, subject to divergent security perceptions, interpretations, and interests. The OSCE accurately focuses on prevention and on strengthening states' capabilities in terms of human rights, democratic institutions, and the rule of law against various factors which are fertile ground for terrorist actions. Yet, greater political will is necessary in order to adequately address root causes, primarily the widening economic and social discrepancies worldwide. The implication of terrorism with organized crime and weapons of mass destruction stress the imperative need for strict observance of international law and of the primary law of the UN Security Council for the maintenance of international order. The OSCE must enhance efforts towards ensuring participating states full compliance with their human dimension-related commitments, which in turn must be reflected in adequate anti-terrorist policies. As lawmakers, we must ensure that anti-terrorist actions and promoting human rights are complementary and mutually reinforcing. It is our duty to uphold democratic institutions and to ensure that checks and balances are well in place, not least regarding the democratic political control of the military and security forces, the police, and the intelligence. Finally, our contribution may prove essential towards further fostering mutual understanding based upon common values and principles and a positive state of mind that rejects identification of terrorism with any religion, nation, or people. Thank you, Mr. President.
Merci, mon cher collègue Kafkalias. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Artaz Gegamian d'Arménie.
уважаемые коллеги, Армения вот уже 21 год почти еженедельно подвергается террористическим атакам, а последняя атака произошла буквально вчера, когда житель Тавушской области Айкосакян снайперским выстрелом со стороны Азербайджана был тяжело ранен. Да, услышав доклад генерала армии, известного борца против терроризма Николая Ковалева, мы пришли к выводу в очередной раз, что дело имеем с интернациональным терроризмом, и ему надо противопоставить наши совместные усилия. К сожалению, наличие этой опасности Армения почувствовала на себе уже в 1992 году, когда против сил самообороны Нагорного Карабаха воевали в том числе и террористические группировки, руководимые известным террористом Амир ибн Аль-Хаттабом, который одновременно являлся руководителем Исламской международной миротворческой бригады. К сожалению, террористическим атакам подвергаются армяне, которые проживают в Сирии, проживают в Ираке, в Ливане, в Египте. Поэтому Армения кровно заинтересована в этом. Для успешной борьбы с терроризмом необходима координация усилий. Опыт такой координации усилий есть, когда в рамках СНГ действовал комитет по антитеррору, руководителем которого был Николай Ковалев, а также участвовал наш президент Серж Саркисян, который в те годы руководил службой безопасности. И благодаря совместным усилиям были предотвращены более 1500 террористических акций, в результате которых сотни тысяч людей были спасены их жизни. При координации усилий борцов против терроризма и в Армении удалось избежать многих террористических атак. Я полностью поддерживаю высказывание докладчика о необходимости унификации определения международного терроризма и установления единого подхода борьбы против этого международного зла. Спасибо за внимание.
Merci, mon cher collègue. La parole est maintenant à M. Abdullah du Conseil national palestinien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, the United Nations define terrorism in many forms. Occupation, foreign occupation, is one of the worst type of terrorism because foreign occupation denies the people their right to movement, their right to economic development, their right to reach to their worship places, and therefore we should fight this type of terrorism by working hard to end the foreign occupation of my country. On the other hand, we've been talking about chemical weaponry as a mass destructive weapon, nuclear threat as a mass destructive weapon as well. But then when we take a decision to destroy, dismantle, or at least to ask those countries who have this weaponry to sign the non-proliferation treaty, we should make hard effort to force any country that owns this chemical weapons or nuclear weapon to sign the Treaty of Non-Proliferation, allow its utilities to be open for international inspectors, and at the same time, we should help us to have our Middle East, because too many problems stemming in that region, which is very close to Europe, to have the Middle East as mass destructive free zone. Thank you very much.
Merci. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Azay Gouliyev d'Azerbaïdjan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. There is no single country in the world today that is exempt from the threat of terrorism. Counter-terrorism efforts have been much more effective when there are stable and effective governments in place, and when we all, communities, nations, and the countries were united. In the last 12 years, after September 11, although we have witnessed notable achievements in the counter-terrorism efforts, terrorism remains an undeniable threat to the world. This is primarily because, despite our concerted efforts, the environments in which terrorist organizations develop and thrive still exist across the globe. Some countries are doing an excellent job of combating terrorism by freezing known terrorist assets, creating strict border control mechanisms, and establishing stronger surveillance practices in at-risk locations. However, terrorism differs from region to region. Each region has its own set of characteristics. For example, while terrorism in the Middle Eastern countries is linked to certain extremist groups, terrorism in our region is most often connected with separatism and separatist regimes. It is well known that this type of regimes in our region have taken advantages of uncontrolled territories and have provided financial support and hideouts to terrorist organizations in order to gain a footing. I think the most effective way to counter terrorism is to fight along all of the front line. Therefore, I call participating states to take strong measures against the states that support terrorist, extremist, and separatist activities on the territories of others. Thank you for your attention.
Merci, Monsieur Gouliev. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Georges Tsereteli de Géorgie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Vice President Neri. I think that's a really common goal for all of us to fight down and to confront and combat terrorism. And it was well described, many aspects of that and many angles of this problem here, starting with the killing of people, exploding bombs, and illicit drug trade, and so on and so forth. And I fully agree with my colleague from Azerbaijan. Conflict regions and conflict areas are always very good soil for different crimes should be committed by terrorists. So in that sense, we'd like once again to stress your attention what's happening currently on the territory of Georgia in a conflict zone, a conflict area. My colleague from the delegation described situation where the fencing of our territory moving forward, barbed wires, and I'm very much thankful to all the colleagues who responded to that, who showed their responsibility. And I think that's a responsibility of OSCE and a responsibility of our fellow parliamentarians, because we stated many times, we proved resolutions, we tried to defend human rights, rights of refugees, and what we see in Georgia, unfortunately, that's a continuation, intentional continuation of a occupation of Georgia territory still, which is a very unfortunate effect. And it has a very unfortunate effect on the families, on the refugees, and it's contradicting all our resolutions we made and proved before. So we'd like to see more efforts, more, sharp assessments from the OSCE, and of course, we have to redouble our efforts to reopen and restore mission with a specific police and peacekeeping mandate on the territory of Georgia. I think it's much more appropriate at this time, and we should make much more decisive steps. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Tsereteli. La parole est maintenant à Madame Oksana Kaletnik de l'Ukraine.
Спасибо, господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги. Я не хочу отнимать много времени. Тема действительно очень острая, и такая активность в зале, она прежде всего свидетельствует о том, что здесь нет безразличных. И все еще остается очень много проблем в нашем совместном доме, которые следует сообща решать. И действительно мы сможем решать эти проблемы совместно, следует только научиться прежде всего слушать друг друга и слышать. Я хочу акцентировать ваше внимание на проблеме привлечения террористическими организациями по всему миру так называемой новой крови, молодежи. Со стороны террористов ведется планомерная работа по расширению своих рядов за счет молодежи. Молодые люди не имеют прочного мировоззрения, поддаются их пропаганде и, вступая в сговор, ценой которой является как собственная жизнь, так и жизнь ни в чем не повинных людей. Задача цивилизованного человечества состоит в том, чтобы разум выиграл битву за сердце молодого поколения. А для этого необходимо вести целенаправленную работу с молодыми людьми, потому что всем известно, что молодое поколение – это будущее каждой нации. Сегодня следует как никогда задуматься о том, что в обществе нет прочных духовных устоев, и вследствие этого молодежь, отрываясь от семейных ценностей, которые играют особую роль, особенно в наших славянских народах, впитывают в себя суррогатную культуру псевдодемократии, забывая о долге перед родителями, долге перед Родиной, перед своими будущими детьми. Я призываю объединиться и, объединившись, продумать координацию усилий по разработке общей программы просвещения молодежи в части развенчивания мифа героизма террора. Сегодня мы услышали, что в этом направлении было уже сделано многое в рамках совместных программ. Хочу подчеркнуть особую важность этой работы. И полагаю, что ОБСЕ является той реальной силой, которая способна возглавить и привести в жизнь это начинание. Спасибо и благодарю за внимание.
Merci Madame Kaletnik. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Rui Asikgoz de la Turquie.
Mr. Chairman, distinguished colleagues, terrorism is among leading transnational threats in today's global security environment, and international solidarity is of crucial importance in combating terrorism. In this context, the OSCE's comprehensive approach to security is more relevant than ever. Countering terrorism is a shared priority of the international community, and it requires concrete action as well as bilateral and multilateral cooperation. The Transnational Threats Package of Decision adopted at the Dublin Ministerial Council created a sound and comprehensive basis for OSCE's work on the fight against transnational threats. Full implementation of this decision is necessary to translate political commitments agreed by the participating states into effective and sustainable programmatic action. All states have an obligation to protect those within their jurisdiction from the threat of terrorism and ensure security. This can only be guaranteed in a sustainable manner when based upon the respect of human rights, democracy, and rule of law. One of the main challenges facing us today in the human dimension is the alarming rise of racism, xenophobia, intolerance, and discrimination in the OSCE area. I would like to urge you that this issue has potential security implications for the present as well as the future. Besides, it can be easily exploited by the actors of terrorism. Discrimination against Muslims is a key challenge in this context. Muslim immigrants have been living in OSCE countries for decades. They have been contributing intensively to the economies as well as the social and cultural lives of their host countries. All these facts were acknowledged by OSCEPA resolutions. We are deeply concerned by inclination in some societies where all Muslims are identified with terrorism. We are worried that the problem can turn into an outright threat to safety of innocent individuals. With the rise of far-right political groups in many European countries, we as politicians need to be awake and give right message to our societies. Finally, in Turkey, Kurds are not minority. They are primary and equal component of our population. They have equal rights like ethnic Turkish people. In addition, Lausanne Agreement defines minority clearly. Thank you, President.
Merci, Monsieur Asikgoz. La parole est maintenant à Monsieur Frédéric Azopardi de Malte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, irregular migration is a real threat to the OSCE area and mostly to the Mediterranean area. Many countries are facing a human catastrophe of enormous proportions, with hundreds of people perishing annually. Furthermore, countries receiving this mass influx of irregular migrants are buckling under the stress and are witnessing their resources stretched way beyond their operational needs. Irregular migration poses very real dilemmas for states, as well as exposing migrants themselves to insecurity and vulnerability. Most states have nevertheless failed to manage or control irregular migration effectively or efficiently. What are therefore required are new, more effective and coherent approaches to address the issue of irregular migration, approaches that recognize both the concerns of states in this respect and the need to protect the rights of irregular migrants. It has been proven time and time again that one of the main causes of irregular migration is poverty and corrupt governance. In this context, states should be directed towards programs of assistance. As long as there is great divergence in wealth and corrupt governance between one region and the other, migration will just be a spontaneous, unregulated matter. We therefore should be more creative in this respect. Burden sharing is not a one-way course of action. The burden has to be shared by each according to his means and needs. An important aspect that is often lost in current debates about irregular migrants is that it also has adverse consequences for migrants themselves. This is most obviously the case for the victims of trafficking, who are often exploited in domestic work or cheap labor or sex industry. While dealing with this subject, it is worth emphasizing that while attempting to reconcile state security, we have to extend the basic rights to all migrants. This leads me to conclude by saying that states need to be encouraged to ratify the relevant conventions which they have not. But equally important, it is essential to ensure the proper application and interpretation of those provisions by signatories in order to guarantee that the rights and fundamental freedoms of migrants are respected in practice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, M. Azopardi. La parole est maintenant à M. Epinan Bernard Zabella du Conseil national palestinien.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the question is why and how terrorism has evolved as a phenomenon that brings nightmares to all of us, irrespective of nationality, religion, or ethnicity. We need to search for the root causes without justifying the acts of terrorism or empathizing with them. Our responsibility, all of us and each of us, is to address these root causes in order to stop the proliferation of terrorism. In our Palestinian case, non-violence remains the best position to adopt in order to achieve our national rights. This is the position adopted by Mr. Mahmoud Abbas, our president, and is supported by a majority of our Palestinian people. Allow me to share with you a message of Palestinian Christians, and I am myself a Roman Catholic Palestinian of a family that goes back 1,000 years at least. In a document issued in December 2009 called Kairos Palestine, which stresses that all of us are created in God's image. This is similar to what Judaism and Islam preach. Accordingly, if we stress that we are all similar, and in spite of our differences and preferences, we will respect each other and treat each other with dignity and justice, then this will weaken terrorism and the false justifications given when it is perpetrated. This is the best bridge to stop terrorism in its tracks. Most important, we need to respect human rights and not to focus only on our interests and narrow perspectives. In Palestine, we look forward to the day when peace brings us our natural, inalienable rights that lead to the creation of a Palestinian state that lives in normalcy and neighborliness with all in the region without exception. When this happens, no one can abuse the just cause of our people to mount violent acts in our name. Our people remain committed to nonviolence, as this is the only way to achieve our rights. Your support for our people and its cause is one important way and is much needed to deny all those who choose to abuse our just cause for their own violent designs and acts. Thank you, OSCEPA, for noting this and working on it. Thank you.
Merci, monsieur. La parole est maintenant à monsieur Bomziber du Canada.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Vice President and fellow parliamentarians. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you today on this topic. Countering terrorism and other transnational threats highlights the importance of international cooperation and coordination. It allows us to achieve greater unity in purpose as an organization while challenging us to develop effective and sustainable actions and programs. I would like to commend the work of the OSCE Transnational Threats Department and note the progress that has been made in strengthening coordination and coherence of action in the OSCE, in particular through its capacity building programs. However, we are troubled by increasing Islamic extremism globally and the threat to world peace that it poses. In Canada, efforts at combating terrorism are ongoing. Canada is actively involved in multilateral efforts to develop legal instruments, best practices, and international standards to combat transnational threats and terrorism. These efforts also include Canada's Counter-Terrorism Capacity Building Program. Through this program, Canada provides training, equipment, and technical and legal and other security assistance to help other states prevent and respond to their terrorist activity. These trainings are done in accordance with international counterterrorism and human rights norms, standards, and obligations. We as parliamentarians are called upon to advance this shared effort to counter transnational threats. In doing so, we must endeavor to address the valid concerns for upholding the primacy of the rule of law and the respect for human rights. I recognize that these are not easy conversations to have. They require us to find a balance between maintaining our collective security and upholding our respect for fundamental human rights. This includes, for example, ensuring protection from arbitrary arrest or detention and guarding against unlawful surveillance or unnecessary infringement of privacy rights. Indeed, the debate is a recurring one in Canada where recommendations by two separate public inquiries have reminded us of the importance of adequate accountability structures to monitor counterterrorism efforts and cooperation with other countries. Colleagues, it is our shared interest as parliamentarians to ensure that our state continues their efforts, including through the OSCE and other regional multilateral venues, to combat transnational threats. In the same way, it is our shared responsibility to make certain that these efforts continue to uphold the high respect for human rights. Thank you once again for this opportunity.
Merci, Monsieur Zimmer. La parole est maintenant à Madame Else de Mol de la Belgique, avant-dernière intervenante.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, for years the international fight against terrorism has dominated the world scene. Following the 9/11 attacks, as well as the bombings in Madrid and London, the international community has been preoccupied with the ongoing fight against terrorism. As the title of our meeting suggests, it also has an effect on the respect for the universal human rights. In most of our countries, the police and judicial authorities have broken the rule of law out of security concerns. Lawmakers didn't always intervene. In fact, sometimes they even supported this loose interpretation of basic human rights. To be clear, this is not just a phenomenon in the OSCE region. In fact, in some Asian countries, the authorities target movements pleading for autonomy as terrorist organizations in order to secure international support against these political movements. Colleagues with the International Security and Assistance Force leaving Afghanistan next year, the security focus of the wider European and Atlantic region will no longer be limited to this part of the world. Al-Qaeda is no longer the single threat to our safety. The past 3 to 4 years have seen the rise of new terrorist movements in civil war-torn Syria, but also in the Sahel region. These new terrorist movements are inspired by Al-Qaeda, but have a different bottom-up structure. They derive their support from local problems, as is the case in Mali. The international community and the OSCE countries in particular should remain vigilant and, if necessary, intervene with all necessary political and legal means. The only way to preserve our own democracy and our own rule of law is to respect the basic principles ourselves. We are pleased to see that several OSCE member states are at the vanguard of women and LGTB rights and that progress has been made in recent years. At the same time, other member states have had setbacks on these issues, and it should remain clear that women and gay rights are human rights after all. Especially the countries who are also a partner to the European Treaty for Human Rights should live up to the ideals of this legal instrument. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. Et pour conclure, la parole est au docteur Eddie Fry du Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I wanted to reiterate what some people have been saying. I'm a physician, and for me, you cannot spend all of your time treating a disease. And you cannot spend all of your time treating the symptoms of a disease. You need to find the cause of the disease, and you need to spend a lot of time in prevention. And I heard a very powerful message from our very first panelist today when he talked about the root causes of terrorism. And they are embedded deeply in a lack of equality of opportunity of people around the world and in different countries. And this is closely linked with minority rights. We've heard Turkey talk about how it's linked with xenophobia and it's linked with racism. If you have people who are always unable to seek equality, unable to get opportunity, unable to build decent lives for themselves and their families, they will rise up. History has shown us that. Have we not learned the lessons yet? And so within the rule of law and within all of our nations and within that whole area of the OSCE, we need to think about how we ensure equal rights. In Canada, I don't say that we're the greatest country in the world, but we are a country made up of people who have come from every corner of the globe. And we have a Charter of Rights, and in it, there's a Section 15 on minority rights that says that no matter how small the minority group, whether it's a racial, ethnic, religious, LGBT group, women, gender, all of these reasons makes you a minority within Canada. You have equal rights under the law. So if we're going to look at terrorism and if we're going to use rule of law in the OSCE, then we need to look at how we ensure equal rights for even the smallest minority group so that they can begin to contribute to the nation's well-being, to participate, to have equality, to become full citizens. Until we do that, people will continually seek equality, continually seek to get opportunity, and we will always have terrorism. And those who exploit it, the transnational terrorist groups, the international terrorist groups that exploit this desire for equality will always win. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Fry. La séance est maintenant terminée. Tous les intervenants sont intervenus dans le cadre du temps qui leur a été imparti. Je les en remercie et je les remercie également pour la richesse de leur intervention. Je pense que nous avons contribué à renforcer la sécurité dans la région de l'OSCE par nos réflexions. La séance est levée. Je vous rappelle qu'il y a une possibilité pour ceux qui le souhaitent de participer à un débat sur le désarmement nucléaire pendant la pause déjeuner et nos travaux reprendront à 16 h cet après-midi. Merci à tous et bon appétit.